Hello, and welcome to the Momentum Ministry Partners podcast. This podcast is designed to provide that momentum in our God-given roles of leadership as we partner together to equip today's Christian leaders for tomorrow's opportunities. Thank you so much, and we hope you enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome back to another Momentum Ministry Partners podcast. This is a bonus episode for you. I'm your host, Eric Miller. I am also the Executive Director of Ministry with Momentum Ministry Partners. Today, we really want to dive into this context and conversation about preparing for your summer mission trip, your summer youth conference, your summer camp, to help you youth pastors, your student ministry leaders have maximum impact for those opportunities. So I'm bringing 16 years of being a youth pastor to this conversation, but I also reached out to some friends of mine, some ministry partners, and asked them, what are things that you've learned in all the years of going to Momentum Youth Conference or the mission trip or camp or whatever that you go to? So there is a video component to this podcast that I want to let you know about here early in the conversation. We're going to do an analogy that I think will be helpful if you can see the visual. And so if you're listening to this on the audio side, hop over to our YouTube channel. I'd highly recommend you subscribe to our YouTube channel as we do all of our podcasts on the video component, and we post those to YouTube as well. You can search Momentum Ministry Partners on YouTube to find that, and you'll see this episode there as well. So let's dive in. Our conversation today, we really want to help you prepare for your trip. I would strongly recommend coming to Momentum Youth Conference. I'm a veteran of that. I was doing the math earlier. I think I've been to 28 youth conferences, both as a student, as a youth pastor, and now getting to lead the organization. But the beauty of that is seeing how God works in and through those weeks. And so if you're tuning in and you're not coming to Momentum Youth Conference, that's okay. There will be application and principles that will still apply to you as you prepare for your mission trip or your camp. But we would highly encourage you to check out Momentum Youth Conference. All right, so let's dive in to today's conversation. I want to encourage you to think about this in three phases: pre-trip, during the trip, and post-trip. All right, so we're going to kind of break this down into three categories. As you're a youth pastor, a leader, maybe you're a parent and you're leading a mission trip, you signed up for something, there's a whole lot of planning that goes into a trip for your youth conference ahead of time. But when you have a plan and you set it up right, I honestly believe with all my heart, you can see God do so much in and through these trips and these opportunities if you can strategize and go into it. So the very first thing, every youth pastor that I talked to said the same thing. The number one most important thing that you can do before your trip is to pray. Pray. I know that sounds so elementary. I know as I'm talking to a bunch of pastors and ministry leaders, you're like, yeah. That's not why I'm listening to this episode. Give me the tips and tricks that you've learned along the way. But I am telling you, prayer is by far the most important thing that you could possibly do. Let me just put this in perspective maybe. Somebody had to do this for me at one point, and it was convicting. You're wonderful. You're a phenomenal leader. You're being tasked to lead this trip for a reason, but you are not sovereign. You're not in control. You're not all powerful. And God is. He is the one that we should be leaning on. He is the one that we should be pressing into. And so I would encourage you to think about as many ways as you can possibly think of to pray over the students that are going to youth conference with you, pray over the list of people who are going to your camp or your mission trip, pray over the leaders who are going. I've even done this where I've printed the list of names of people, every single person, myself included, and I'd give them to all of the students, give them to all of the leaders on that trip, give them to your church staff. We've even gone so far as give them to your church congregation and ask the people of your church to pray by name and for specific things over those people that are going. As a youth pastor, you might even have students that are going and you're like, they're brand new. I don't know how to pray for them. I don't know what to pray for them about. Just let the Spirit lead, and whatever he puts on your heart, pray over those things. Pray that God would have an encounter and that his presence would be tangible during that time. We've even made a list of the schedule and the events or the days and the itinerary where we're going to go on our mission trip, and given that to the church staff and given that to the parents and given that to the church congregation, and asked them to pray over those things. Sometimes we've made a like hour by hour or a day by day slot that we would fill with prayer warriors during those times. And Aunt Betsy knew that on Thursday she's praying, and that's her time slot, and she's our prayer warrior for that time. And for me, then leading that trip, I knew that we had prayer coverage. I knew there were people that I could call or text and say, hey, praise God, this is an answer to prayer, or keep praying for this, or pray for this person. They're so close to putting their trust in Jesus, maybe for the first time. To have a team of prayer warriors that are behind you is such a big deal. But for you, if you're the leader, if you're the primary point person and you're leading this trip, I would challenge you to pray more than you plan. The amount of time or the hours that you spend in thinking through the logistics, at calling the bus company, at making sure the sleeping arrangements are set up, at figuring out the meals, like, if you were to track the amount of time, the hours that you're spending, are you praying equal or more to the amount of time that you're planning? That's a big deal. And when you start praying through all of those things, man, do you see God show up and do incredible, incredible things. The other side of this praying is, I would say, it's sometimes easy as ministry leaders to just kind of pray in generic senses, or to just pray because we know we should. But I would challenge you to even go deeper and further with that. Pray with boldness, pray expectantly, and pray specifically. Pray for your people by name, but pray with boldness that God would show up, that you're expecting him to do something amazing, that you're going to lean into the Lord in powerful ways, that then it's clear at the end of the trip that when you look back and you see those answers to prayer, you know it's because you prayed, and you actually can't take any of the credit then. It's not about, man, our leaders were amazing. It's not about the speaker was phenomenal. It's not about the training that we received, but you give credit to the Lord because you were praying and expecting him to do something amazing. Another thing that I've learned this the hard way, but the pre-trip side, go into your trip rested. Listen, friends, I know you're busy. I know there's a lot of things going on. Maybe you've got back-to-back mission trips and you're coming in fresh. You literally get home and you change bags and you do a load of laundry and you repack and you're back out on the road. If you can avoid that, I would highly recommend avoiding that if possible. But going into the trip rested, both physically, but emotionally and spiritually as well. When you go into those trips rested, you're in the right frame of mind. It allows you during the trip to be present, to be intentional. Maybe you even before the trip, you write down a list of questions of things that you want to ask your students. Maybe you want to go through and plan out what are the people or the intentional conversations that I want to have. Who needs encouragement? How can I follow up with these people? What's the path forward? And so even as you're going into your trip and you're being well rested and you're anticipating through prayer what God would do in this time, the other piece of that is, I would say, dream. Right? Plan, write down, God, what are the things that we want to see you do in and through this time? What do I want to see? How does this trip catapult into our ministry? How can we not just have this be the mountaintop experience, but something, a jumping off point? Okay. And so those things are a big, big deal. All right. During the trip, man, be present. Be present with your students. I know Momentum Youth Conference is a great example. You get to see a lot of friends and other youth pastors and people that you want to connect and engage with. but be present for your students, your staff, the people that are there. Be present, okay? You're there for those students. They're signing up to go on that trip. They're expecting God to move and work. So be present with them. Prioritize your students during that trip. The second thing, engage in spiritual conversation. Your students have already signed up to go on this trip, and they're committing. They're expecting that this is a deeper, more meaningful. I'm going to make a movement or a progress in my relationship with Christ, and so they're expecting that. So they're expecting to have spiritual conversation. Don't feel like if you're the youth pastor or leader that you have to like warm up the conversation or build the relationship. That's the purpose of this trip, right? So you can quickly move into spiritual conversations where in your week-to-week youth ministry, you might like, hey, what are things that you enjoy doing? You can jump beyond that. Start by asking key questions like, what are you expecting God to do during this week? Or why did you decide to come on this trip? Or what's something you're nervous about? Or how can I be praying for you? Dive into those spiritual conversations in meaningful ways. And I think you'll see your students open up, engage with you in unique ways. And then encourage your leaders to do the same. Encourage them to maybe even you make a checklist where your goal is to engage in a deeper, more spiritual conversation with every student that's there, and document those things. Write them down. When you have a meaningful conversation with the student, write it down. Maybe you keep a note on your phone or in your journal. You write down, man, thank you, God, for this conversation. But just so you can remember, so that after the trip, you can follow up with them on those things as well. The last thing maybe during the trip that you can do or something to be aware of is delegate, right? You don't have to be the superhero. You don't have to navigate every conversation. You don't have to be the one to do it all. You can delegate, ask and take other people with you even into those conversations, maybe that are meaningful or that are needed, where you're confronting a sin issue or challenging and encouraging something in someone in a unique way. Take people with you. Ask your leaders who are having connection with those students to engage in those conversations as well. And last thing is plan. Okay, plan to go home before you go home. This is a big, big deal. While you're on the trip, as you see God working, as you see your students having those light bulb moments where they're making commitments and they're saying, this is something I want to do when I go home, help them put a plan in place before they get home. I can tell you so many times, I don't know what it is, but something happens. It makes me believe that the enemy is real and spiritual warfare is real. When you set foot on your home church and you get off the bus, these students like that, they forget the commitments they made. Or maybe they wanted to start a Bible study at their school and they get home and they're like, I want to tell my mom and dad I'm going to start a Bible study at my school, and then they sleep. Right? They get home and they go to bed. They're in their own bed, in their own room, and something happens where that morphs to like, hey, I think I want to read my Bible more. And they change their goal just because some time has passed, and maybe they shy away from or they get fearful of what they were committing to do or what God was really placing on their heart. So help them make a plan. Write those things down. Maybe it's, I need to talk to my mom and dad. Maybe it's, I need to confess some things. Maybe it's, these are the goals that I have. Would you help me with that? And then as you go home, you can help follow up. So when you go home, the post-trip, again, pray. You should pray during the trip too, but when you go home, pray for those things. Check in, ask your students, follow up with them. Maybe it's holding them accountable to things. All right. So all those things, pre, during, and post, hopefully are going to help you make the most out of your summer. All right. Now, for those of you who are going to Momentum Youth Conference, I know that this is something, here's the visual illustration. I know that this is something that worked for me in my youth ministry. And I think there's transferable principles here with mission trips or with other camps and conferences. But I want to give you something that I used year after year with my youth ministry. Okay. And I would literally tell my students this. So night one, sometimes even before we would leave for our trip, I would give them this overview. So I have here a toolbox, okay? This is just a visual representation for you to see, but I would encourage my students, I would literally tell them, I'm going to give you an empty toolbox at the beginning of the trip. Not a literal toolbox. I didn't buy toolboxes for them, but I would give them this metaphor. I'm going to give you a toolbox, and while you're on this trip, the speakers that you hear, how God speaks to you and connects through the speaker. Maybe you're going to go to a power track. Maybe it's a conversation that you have late at night in the dorm. But God is going to fill your toolbox. If you're expectant and if you're prepared for him to do so, he's going to give you tools, and he's going to train you how to use those tools so that you can go home and use those tools. All right, now I have here a hammer. All right. We know that a hammer is used for driving nails, or the claw is used to take out nails, right? A hammer is probably not used. It's hard to use this to drive a screw or as a drill. There's a specific purpose for a hammer, right? So maybe students need to learn how to use a hammer. Maybe this is the equivalent to something spiritual like learning how to read the Bible, right? Maybe the hammer is used in a spiritual sense like learning how to avoid temptation, right? Learning how to pray. So as students get a hammer to put in their toolbox, they're going to need to learn how to use that hammer both during the trip, but ultimately in preparation for when they get back home, for the weeks and months after your trip is over, where they can go, oh yeah, I learned how to use a hammer. I need to use that hammer. I need to pull that back out of my toolbox when I'm at school, when I'm engaging in that conversation, when I'm facing temptation, anxiety, peer pressure. Maybe they need to learn how to use a tape measure. They're going to get another tool, and they have a tape measure that they can learn how to use to measure the effectiveness of their ministry, to measure whatever it is. But they're going to get a whole bunch of tools. I have a chisel, right? Maybe they're going to get a tool like this, where they're like, I don't even know what that is, right? This is a stud finder. You can put this against the drywall and find where the studs are behind it, okay? I won't make dad or pastor jokes right now about the stud finder, right? But maybe they get a tool or something like this where they're like, I don't know what this tool is for. I don't know why I'm in here. I don't know why I'm in this power track. I don't know why this speaker's talking about this, but as a youth pastor, when you prepare your students to go in expectantly, write down whatever you learn, whatever the session is, bring a journal, make a packing list, write those things down, and encourage your students to track the things that they're learning, because you never know when they're going to need to go back and they're like, oh, that's a square. That's used for drawing straight lines and measuring things and making angle cuts. That's used to find the things that are hidden that I can't actually see. And when they can go back to those things and pull them out, and God can use those opportunities, God can use those sessions, those speakers in a powerful way, because they've written those things down, because they've come into that trip expectantly. Now, at Momentum Youth Conference, we want to be your ministry partner to help you put tools in your students' toolbox. That's one of the reasons I love Momentum Youth Conference. That's one of the reasons we want this to be a resource to you in this conversation, to help you have maximum impact in your student ministry and equip your students to go back home and have maximum impact to live on mission for the Lord. Thanks for tuning into this episode. I hope it's been helpful. If you have questions, if you have follow-up, I'm here. I'd love to reach out. I'd love to connect with you and help you have maximum impact in your student ministry as well. Thanks so much for tuning into this bonus episode.
Well, guys, I think that's going to do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening. We'd be really honored if you went ahead and subscribed to the podcast, and that way you can just kind of stay up to date with the episodes that we're posting in the future. To learn more about Momentum Ministry Partners and our many other resources, please be sure to follow us on social media at Momentum Ministry Partners, or check out our website, www.buildmomentum.org.